Hey, micro friends. We're back in 326. Ain't nobody here to talk to, but at least I can stand up and talk at you. So, we've been going through different kinds of systems and the bacteria that can get in there and some of the ideas here. So, we went through the GI tract and the respiratory tract. Now we're going to look at things that can get into you from like bites and wounds, transdermal infections. So the skin is a very tough defense. If you kind of think about this, you're not at risk of dissolving if you wash your hands with soap and water, contrary to what my child used to think. And that's because our skin is made up of cells that are packed with proteins like keratin and extracellular matrix proteins like laminin and fibronectin. And these proteins, unlike most of the proteins in a cell, are in fact cross-linked. They're covalently bonded, and so it is really, really hard to solubilize skin. And so as a cell biologist, one of the things I often do is solubilize stuff, that is, extract proteins from it. Skin is really tough. I'll just tell you, you can take a piece of skin, put it into a tube, add detergents, add various sorts of solubilizing agents like 8-molar urea, and not much happens. You don't get that much stuff off because skin is so tough. Now, under the layer of the squamous epithelium, we have cells that you can begin to actually extract stuff from. But this outer layer right here, it is darn tough. Now, there are entryways and entry portals that we're going to see can become infected. Things like a hair shaft is got a hole there. There are sweat pores, and we're going to see these are spots that actually can become infected. So you can get little boils and things like that. But we're also going to talk about the kinds of infections that happen if you puncture the skin. And so it's a specific set of bacteria that we have to be thinking about. So we can break this down to a couple of different kinds of categories. Let's start with wound-related infections. And these are going to be infections that occur because you are breaking apart the skin. And not so much things that are getting deep in, but just stuff that's on your skin and on surfaces that you touch. When you get a little boo-boo, you scrape your knee. All right? So, to start with, a standard kind of infection that can happen if you scrape yourself in soil, particularly like on a farm, something you've heard of, I'm sure, before, and that is anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, or anthracis? Yeah, Bacillus anthracis. It is a gram-positive bacteria. It's aerobic, and it forms endospores, which means it's pretty darn tough. And the source is going to be primarily from soil. Animals also can further contaminate the soil. And so you have anthrax spores that can then germinate and begin spreading as bacteria. If you were to go out in the front yard of wherever you happen to be standing and dig around in the soil, you probably would find anthrax. So it's not all that hard to find. It's generally not in real high concentration. But the concern is that there are a couple of forms of it that are really, really dangerous. So inhalation is a particularly serious kind of disease transmission for anthrax. It is pretty damn deadly if not treated. Even if it's recognized early, it's still pretty serious. And so inhaled anthrax is kind of your standard weaponized bioweapon. What you do is you take endospores and actually weaponize it. The endospores themselves are slightly shaved. They're kind of shaken to where they are going to really be very light, and you get this dust powder. And if inhaled, it can be pretty darn serious. Ingestion is another area, but then cutaneous skin contact, an infection of an open wound, or punctures, and still a pretty high mortality rate. So you have to worry about if you get a cut that is contaminated with soil. So like you're out in the garden or you scrape your knee, these are the kinds of things you do need to be aware of, be thinking about. Anthrax is naturally occurring, particularly where you have livestock. The anthrax itself has a number of different kinds of parts to it that are part of what makes it so deadly. In 2001, there was a mail attack in which there were envelopes that had powdered spores. 17 people were infected, 5 deaths. These were letters that were sent to the Congress, to U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate offices. And exactly where it was coming from was not still all that well known. So the toxin can bind cell receptors, and it allows for a variety of different kinds of lethal factors to get into the cell, cause the cells to swell up. You end up with a lot of edema and a lot of cell death, which then begins to generate even further fluid accumulation, and so lots of different kinds of problems. Another bacterium that we have to be thoughtful about is the bacteria that causes tetanus. This is a Clostridium bacteria. Clostridium bacteria, Clostridium tetani, it's gram-positive, endospore-forming. It is an anaerobe. Now that means that it's only going to be growing in areas in which you have minimal oxygen. Now, the symptoms of tetanus, also known as lockjaw, are extreme, very high muscle contractions. And so you end up with people arching, and this is a standard kind of phenomenon of uncontrollable muscle contraction, which is referred to as tetany, and that's why this is known as tetanus. So tetanus produces a toxin that is able to block the inhibitory signals needed to relax muscles. So the contraction from excitatory signals is being blocked by botulism toxin, but this is inhibiting the signal needed to relax muscles. So rather than blocking the signals that cause muscles to contract, thereby relaxing them, this is blocking signals that would cause muscles to relax. And so it is pretty much the opposite effect of this incredible tightening and contraction of your muscles. Be very, very uncomfortable. All right. We've got pretty good prevention for tetanus because, actually, here's a really interesting thing to think about. Let's just get back here. Tetanus is the concern, like, when you step on a rusty nail, you have some kind of puncture wound. That's when we worry about tetanus. And let's think about this for a moment. So you get a puncture wound. The wound closes back up. You've got bacteria in there. The aerobic bacteria that are going to be all around and on the skin surface, they begin to carry out respiration. They pull the oxygen out. They make that wound anaerobic. And that allows tetanus to grow. That's why a puncture wound is a real serious concern, because it does allow for the kind of environment that would allow anaerobic bacteria like tetanus to begin growing. So you're not going to get tetanus bacteria on the cell surface. It's only going to be in deep wounds. And so puncture wounds, because of the fact they seal up, end up being a problem. Now, if you have a wound that is going to be open to the air, you got other problems, but you don't have to worry about tetanus. So with this, what you got to do is actually get antibiotics into that wound, and it's a rather painful thing. You got a puncture wound, and now someone's stabbing a probe with different kinds of antibiotic creams and things. No, unpleasant. Happily, we have prevention via the vaccine that you know of as the DTaP vaccine. This is a bacterium or a range of antigens that will inhibit the growth of, or give you immunity to tetanus, diphtheria, and the Bordetella pertussis bacterium, which causes cough. So we've got then a really good vaccine in the form of the DTaP vaccine. If you have a puncture wound, or if you've been involved in some kind of abrasive injury that could lead to injuries inside and underneath the skin, very often they'll either ask you, when was your last tetanus shot? Because the tetanus vaccine isn't all that long-lived, probably about 8 or 9 years. And that's why, as a general preventative, they go ahead and give you a tetanus shot. So probably to start at Milliken, you all had to have a tetanus shot or a record of having had a tetanus shot recently. Here's just a list of the different kinds of childhood adolescent immunization schedules, and here we have DTaP. So the tetanus is primarily what's going to be given to you in later ages. Okay, lots of different kinds of vaccines. You probably have a lot of them. If you're going to be working in the healthcare industry, you got to get a whole range of different vaccines, and it's a good idea to do that too. All right, now these are some pretty disgusting images. Another Clostridium bacterium. And just as a note, Clostridium bacteria, when you see them, they're generally anaerobic. Gram-positive anaerobic forms endospores, and this causes a phenomenon known as gas gangrene. Essentially, you have an infection, the bacteria begin to generate a whole range of gases as they're breaking down metabolites. And they also generate a range of enzymes that can begin dissolving the tissues. That's how they're getting their energy, getting their metabolites, getting the food. So a puncture wound is another place where Clostridium now can get in, because again, it's an anaerobe. All right, so you end up with these necrotic patches and swelling because of the gas. Yuck. You get a closed wound, that is some kind of puncture. This is going to result in increased edema, which is going to further tighten up around that hole and seal it up even tighter. And it continues to spread away from the point of initial infection. And so you'll have, this happens when people have like an amputation, like a field amputation. And you have bacteria getting in, and it starts moving further up. They begin to start generating the decay and necrosis, and then the gas. And so we have here a progression of the infection. So you could have a wound up here, and then it can begin progressing further down the leg. And this is why back, during Civil War era, and heck, prior to the invention of antibiotics, if somebody had a really serious wound, like a compound fracture in which the bones were open, this is an obvious place to get bacteria in deep into the tissue. There really wasn't much you could do other than amputation to prevent the formation of gangrenous tissue. Yuck. All right, but now on a happier note, well, it's still reasonably toxic, but it's not terrible. And this is a bacterium that causes leptospirosis, Leptospirae interrogans. It's a pretty cool-looking bacterium. It's a spirochete, and that means it's got this spiral shape to it. It's gram-negative. A lot of folks have been exposed to it and don't have much of an effect. You have rodent carriers and wild animals that can then pass it on to livestock and plants. The source of this is primarily from wild animals. So you get this in to an open wound, and over time it can begin to cause a whole systemic range of problems, everything from meningitis to renal dysfunction, head to tail, So again, what you do is when you get a wound, you wash it. So with this bacterium, we've got a set of phenomena that occur in leptospirosis. So you have infection by contact of an open wound with contaminated soil or water, and it progresses in stages, not surprisingly. And as the figure pointed out here, a lot of people have been exposed to it and don't have particular effects. So the initial stages could be very mild, and you generate an immune response to it and you knock it back. If the bacterial load's high enough, if you're a little bit immune compromised, you can start to have the next level of symptoms, ranging from sort of flu-like symptoms and things. You do have neck stiffness, which is a bit of a key that this is a bacterial problem and not a viral problem. The second stage, we start to have more kinds of systemic infections. Eyes can become cloudy. You start ending up with liver damage, which is part of why the eyes become cloudy and yellow, jaundice. Kidney damage, reduced urine output. You can end up with pretty severe problems here at this point. Profuse bleeding from the lungs, 50% lethality at that point. That's letting it go for a long time. All right, so what we've got to do is, when we've got a open wound, we need to treat it with antiseptic, an antibiotic. So here's another bacterium, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This is an aerobic and motile bacterium. It's able to actually move around, and it actually fluoresces under UV light, so you can see it that way. And if the host is immune compromised, it's possible that this bacteria can produce a wide range of different kinds of infections. So people like with cystic fibrosis, they are at high risk for a range of different respiratory infections and things like this. Okay. Now, that's enough stabbing. And so we're not talking about anaerobic guys. Let's think about things that can happen when we just scrape ourselves. So a dermal infection, abrasions. So you can get these kinds of things, a scrape, you scrape your knee, mat burn by football, or contact sports when you fall on the ground, skidding. This is going to allow primarily bacteria that are on the surface of the skin naturally access to just the next layer. Staph aureus is a primary culprit for these kinds of things. It can result in rashes, pustules, boils, things that become a little bit more significant, like cellulitis, which is an inflammation of the tissues underneath the skin. People that are immune compromised are going to have a particularly serious problem. Bulk of us, we've got this bacteria on our surface, and any kind of scratch or wound, it can get in. But hopefully, with a reasonable immune system, you're going to be all right. I mean, it's actually interesting to think about, and I just as a question, how many of you have had a bacterial infection from a cut? And I get wounds all the time. I cut myself. I was cutting something in the kitchen, cut myself with a knife. Most of the time, you don't have any effect. But, if you are cutting up foods, that is a real potential issue, because the blade can be contaminated with a variety of things from the foodstuffs. So you can get that in. I've had various weird infections come about from construction work where I've stabbed myself a bit. And one of the things is that we live in the modern era. You start to feel stiffness. You start to see redding and swelling. You go to the doctor, they get you a Z-Pack. If you didn't have access to this, you'd wait, and you hope that it didn't get worse. If you're reasonably healthy, your immune system's going to knock it back. This is when you begin, soaking it in warm water, trying to encourage greater blood flow and macrophages to get there and start eating it up. But having antibiotic creams makes it so it works a lot better. But it is something we have to be thoughtful about. Is that a small cut, paper cuts, they could lead to infection. Just one more thing to make you that much more paranoid. So these kinds of surface infections are working on the fact that we've got various body fluids. They have good access to oxygen because it's on the surface, and they're kind of designed to fit into that sort of environment, that sort of niche. Other issues that are a problem for these bacteria that are on the surface of skin getting into places where they don't belong, things like catheters and various implants. These are all going to require breaching the skin defenses, and that is an obvious opportunity for infection. Staph epidermidis, Staph epidermidis and Staph aureus are particular problems. Epidermidis can form a biofilm, and remember we talked about the idea of the biofilm is this kind of communicating layer of bacteria. And here's an electron micrograph of looking at staph on a vascular catheter, something that's going to be going into the bloodstream. So it's really critical that you follow scrupulous sanitary procedures when you're starting an IV. Certainly, if you're going to be running things like a catheter for doing any kind of vascular work with stents and things, these guys got to be really, really sterile. And so, if you've seen these events, what you know is when you're starting an IV, you certainly are wiping down the area very well with ethanol or with alcohol. And you're putting the IV in, it is it's sterile, under a cover, and you're very careful to not get any kind of contact on it. And you have to be very careful about the site where the IV goes in. Instruments that are being used for catheterization have to be very carefully sterilized. And for a catheter, like doing a stent into a cardiac procedure, you'll dress the area. You'll swab it down with betadine. You'll really, really make sure that area is clean. And you're doing this in a pretty sterile environment. So it's because the possibility of getting bacteria deep into the body is there, and we don't want that to happen. So these biofilms can be very serious issues. A particular problem with biofilms, we got coronary implants, stents and things, but artificial joints, artificial hip replacement has been a standard kind of bad spot for bacterial infection. We can have the chrome implant actually have a little bit of bacteria. It gets embedded into the bone, and biofilms can form, and it can be very difficult to get antibiotics into there, and the only recourse is to actually perform another surgery and remove this thing, swab the whole area out. Pretty serious problem. So biofilms are a concern because of this. All right, we're going to stop here, and we'll get into vector-borne bacterial infections, things like insect bites. What better way to get past the skin than a little insect bite? So the vector is the animal that transmits the disease to another organism. And so here we've got Anopheles mosquitoes. These are the guys that carry things like Zika and West Nile. Lice, tsetse fly, fleas, great place to carry plague. Deer ticks, things that can carry Lyme disease. The sandfly, carrying various kinds of diseases as well. We'll pick up on this on Monday. So don't get bitten by anything over the Halloween weekend. And if you do have any scrapes or boo-boos, make sure you keep them clean. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.